Here's something nobody tells you about spiritual awakening. It's not about adding more practices, insights, or higher consciousness to your life. It's actually about quitting things you never realized were keeping you trapped in the first place. Most people think awakening means becoming more spiritual, more positive, more enlightened. But Carl Jung understood something far more radical. True awakening happens when you start shedding the layers of who you thought you had to be. The paradox is that the very behaviors that once made you feel safe, accepted, and good are often the same ones blocking you from experiencing genuine freedom and authentic connection. What if I told you that your need for approval is actually keeping you disconnected from your true self? That your addiction to certainty is preventing you from accessing real wisdom? That even your spiritual practices might be elaborate ways of avoiding the very growth you're seeking? These aren't comfortable truths, but they're the hidden doorways to a kind of peace that doesn't depend on everything going perfectly or everyone liking you. The 7 things we're going to explore today aren't just habits you'll outgrow, they're identity shifts that will fundamentally change how you move through the world. You're probably going through some version of this right now, feeling like the old ways of being don't fit anymore but not quite knowing what comes next. Maybe you've noticed yourself getting physically uncomfortable when you people please, or feeling exhausted by maintaining a positive facade when life gets messy. These aren't signs that something's wrong with you, they're signs that something's finally going right. Your soul is outgrowing containers that were too small, and what feels like falling apart is actually the beginning of coming together in a completely new way. There's something fascinating that happens when someone starts awakening spiritually. They begin developing what you might call an approval intolerance. It's like suddenly becoming lactose intolerant, but instead of dairy making you sick, it's people-pleasing that starts churning your stomach. One day you're saying yes to your boss's unreasonable request, or agreeing with your mom's criticism just to keep the peace, and suddenly there's this physical sensation that wasn't there before. Your body starts rejecting the very thing you once craved, and honestly it can feel pretty disorienting at first. It's as if your inner compass finally got recalibrated, and now it's pointing toward authenticity instead of acceptance. Jung would have called this the moment when your persona, that carefully crafted mask you wear for the world, starts feeling uncomfortably tight. You know that feeling when you're wearing shoes that used to fit perfectly, but now they're pinching your toes? That's exactly what happens with approval-seeking behaviors during spiritual awakening. The good girl, or nice guy identity that once felt so natural, suddenly feels like you're suffocating in someone else's clothes. Your true self begins emerging from underneath all those layers of, what will they think? And, I need to be liked. And there's no going back once you feel that authentic breath of fresh air. It's terrifying and liberating at the same time.
The beautiful thing is, you don't have to make dramatic changes overnight. Small shifts create the biggest transformations. When you catch yourself about to say yes when you mean no, try this simple tool. Take 3 deep breaths and then speak one completely honest sentence. Maybe it's, I need to think about that, or that doesn't work for me. But whatever it is, let it come from your gut, not your fear. You'll be amazed how quickly people adjust to your newfound honesty, and more importantly, how much energy you suddenly have available for things that actually matter to you. There's this profound shift that happens. You stop asking the world for permission to exist, and start giving yourself inner permission to be real. Here's something nobody tells you about spiritual awakening. It's not about adding more practices, insights, or higher consciousness to your life. It's actually about quitting things you never realized were keeping you trapped in the first place. Most people think awakening means becoming more spiritual, more positive, more enlightened, but Carl Jung understood something far more radical. True awakening happens when you start shedding the layers of who you thought you had to be. The paradox is that the very behaviors that once made you feel safe, accepted, and good are often the same ones blocking you from experiencing genuine freedom and authentic connection. It's like catching yourself in the mirror wearing a costume you forgot you put on. You might find yourself dropping spiritual buzzwords in conversations, name-dropping your meditation teacher, or subtly letting people know about your latest profound insight. And then, boom, you see right through your own performance. There's this moment of recognition that's both cringeworthy and compassionate, like watching your teenage self trying too hard at a party. The beautiful part is when you can actually laugh at yourself, instead of spiraling into shame about it.
Think about how a flower blooms without needing an audience. It doesn't check Instagram to see how many likes it got or compare its petals to the rose next door. Value doesn't need a stage, and wisdom doesn't require a spotlight.
Jung talked about this as moving from inflation, thinking you're super special, through deflation, realizing you're just human, and finally into integration, being okay with being beautifully ordinary.
It's actually a relief when you stop carrying the exhausting burden of being remarkable all the time. You can just exist without having to justify your existence through achievements, insights, or how awakened you appear to others.
One of the most powerful practices during this phase is what I call the small, quiet acts challenge. Do something helpful for someone without them ever knowing it was you. Pay for the coffee of the person behind you anonymously. Leave an encouraging note where a stressed coworker will find it, or clean up litter in your neighborhood without posting about it. These actions bypass the ego entirely because there's no recognition, no good person points to collect. You start discovering that your worth isn't tied to being seen or acknowledged, and paradoxically, this is when you become truly magnetic, not because you're trying to be special, but because you've stopped trying at all. There's this unspoken rule in our culture that says you should always be fine, always radiating good vibes, always looking like you've got it together. But spiritual awakening reveals this for what it really is, a costume that's way too small for the fullness of human experience. The good vibes only mentality isn't enlightenment. It's actually a form of spiritual bypassing that keeps you disconnected from half of what makes you human. Maturity isn't about maintaining a permanent smile or pretending that grief, anger, or disappointment don't exist. It's about having the courage to embrace the whole reality of being alive. When you stop performing happiness, you discover something far more valuable. Genuine peace that doesn't depend on everything going perfectly.
I once knew a therapist who spent years professionally helping others while maintaining this polished exterior of having everything figured out, until she experienced a significant loss and realized she'd been performing "I'm fine" for so long that she'd forgotten how to actually feel her feelings. The breakthrough came when she stopped trying to bounce back quickly and instead learned to sit with the heaviness, to let tears come without immediately reaching for tissues or explanations. She discovered that her clients connected with her more deeply when she brought her authentic humanity into the room, rather than her professional persona. It was messy, it was real, and it was infinitely more healing for everyone involved.
Here's a simple but powerful practice. When emotions arise, plant your feet firmly on the ground, take a breath, and name what you're feeling in exactly 3 words. No more, no less.
Maybe it's scared and hopeful, or angry but curious, or sad yet grateful. This isn't about analyzing or fixing the feelings, it's about acknowledging them as valid parts of your experience.
You'll notice that emotions move through you much more easily when you stop resisting them or trying to transform them into something more palatable. The goal shifts from positivity to wholeness, and that's where real spiritual growth happens. Most people don't realize they're addicted to certainty until spiritual awakening starts dismantling all their mental security blankets. And suddenly, they're sailing through fog without being able to see the shoreline. The mind absolutely hates this phase because it's been trained to find solid ground, to have all the answers, to know exactly what's coming next. But here's the thing. Certainty is often just fear dressed up as wisdom, and the addiction to knowing keeps you trapped in smaller and smaller boxes. When you can learn to navigate by your internal compass, your values, your intuition, your deeper knowing, instead of needing to see every step of the path, that's when life becomes an adventure instead of a prison.
There's this beautiful story about a scientist who'd built his entire career on being the expert, the one with answers, until he hit a research problem that stumped him completely. Instead of pretending he knew or forcing a solution, he finally said those 3 magical words, "I don't know." Something shifted in that moment. His creativity returned, his curiosity came alive, and he started asking questions he'd never thought to explore before. His best discoveries came not from knowing, but from being comfortable enough with uncertainty to follow interesting threads wherever they led. The paradox is that admitting you don't know opens up infinite possibilities, while pretending you know everything closes them down.
Try this practice that I call maybe journaling. When you catch yourself making definitive statements about your life, your future, or other people's motivations, write down 5 different maybe alternatives instead. Maybe that job rejection was protecting you from something worse. Maybe that difficult person is dealing with pain you can't see. Maybe that setback is redirecting you towards something better. This isn't about being wishy-washy or avoiding decisions. It's about developing what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, being able to tolerate paradox without immediately rushing to resolve it. When you can sit comfortably in the space of not knowing, you become available to wisdom that goes far beyond what your logical mind could ever figure out. There's a predictable progression that happens during spiritual awakening when it comes to blame. First you're angry at everyone else for your problems, then you swing to the opposite extreme and blame yourself for everything. And finally you land somewhere in the middle where you can see patterns without getting stuck in victim or villain mode. The anger phase is actually necessary because it helps you recognize where your boundaries were violated, or where you gave your power away, but staying there keeps you trapped in the past. The self-blame phase feels more spiritual because you're taking responsibility, but it's just blame in a different costume, still keeping you stuck, just with more shame attached. Real growth happens when you can spot the patterns without getting emotionally hijacked by them. I know someone who survived significant trauma and spent years cycling between rage at their abuser and harsh self-criticism for allowing it to happen, until they realized they kept attracting similar dynamics in their adult relationships. The breakthrough wasn't in finding someone to blame, it was in recognizing their own patterns and choosing different boundaries moving forward. They learned to say things like, "That person crossed a line and I'm going to protect myself differently next time," instead of, "They're a terrible person," or "I'm so stupid for trusting them." This shift from blame to radical responsibility was like switching from constantly looking in the rearview mirror to actually steering the car toward where they wanted to go. Here's a tool that cuts through the blame spiral. Create 2 columns on a piece of paper. Label one "What happened" and the other "What I can choose now." In the first column, write the facts without emotional charge, like a court reporter would. In the second column, focus only on actions you can take moving forward, setting boundaries, having conversations, changing patterns, or simply choosing a different response. You'll notice that blame dissolves naturally when you redirect your energy toward what's actually within your control. This isn't about letting people off the hook or pretending everything's fine. It's about reclaiming your power to create different experiences going forward.
Here's where spiritual awakening gets tricky. You discover all these beautiful concepts about oneness and higher consciousness, but then you start using them to avoid feeling anything uncomfortable. Spiritual bypass is like using meditation as a numbing agent instead of awareness practice, or saying everything happens for a reason when you really just don't want to sit with how much something hurts. You might catch yourself floating above your emotions with phrases like, "We're all one," when what you really need is to establish clear boundaries with someone who's mistreating you. The tools that were meant to expand your consciousness become escape hatches from your human experience. And ironically, this keeps you less connected to your authentic self, not more.
I remember working with someone who'd spent years having profound void experiences in meditation. Those states where all sense of self dissolves. But they realized they'd been using these states to avoid grieving the death of their parent. They'd convinced themselves that attachment was the problem, and that enlightened people don't get caught up in loss. But their body was holding all that unexpressed sorrow. The real breakthrough came when they learned to feel their feet on the ground, to breathe into their belly, to let tears come without immediately transcending them. They discovered that true spiritual maturity includes your humanity, not despite it. The goal isn't to escape the human experience, it's to be fully present for all of it.
When difficult emotions arise, try what I call the 90-second feeling window. Instead of immediately trying to shift your state or find a spiritual meaning, just sit with whatever's coming up for exactly 90 seconds. Set a timer, breathe naturally, and let the sensation move through your body without trying to fix, analyze, or transform it. You'll be amazed how much emotions shift and resolve when you stop resisting them or trying to make them more palatable. This practice moves you from floating above your experience to being embodied within it, and that's where real integration happens. There's this sneaky trap that happens during spiritual awakening where you start feeling like nobody around you gets it, and before you know it, you've wrapped yourself in a blanket of spiritual superiority that feels like protection, but is actually just fear wearing a really nice outfit. You might find yourself thinking things like, "These people are so unconscious," or "I can't relate to anyone who isn't on a spiritual path," and suddenly you're living in this isolated bubble where you're the awakened one surrounded by sleepwalkers. The irony is that this separation from others often happens right when you're learning about universal connection and oneness, but isolation, even spiritual isolation, is just another form of unconsciousness disguised as enlightenment. I watched someone go from nobody understands me to having one of the most authentic friendships I've ever witnessed, and the shift happened when they stopped trying to find someone who matched their spiritual vocabulary and instead focused on finding someone who matched their emotional honesty. They realized that their neighbor, who'd never meditated a day in her life but could sit with them during a panic attack without trying to fix anything, was more spiritually mature than some of the people in their meditation group who had all the right words but couldn't handle real human messiness. Connection isn't about finding people who speak your language, it's about finding people who can handle your truth, and that's available at every level of consciousness. Here's a practice I call boundaries plus bridge. Choose one person in your life and make one genuinely vulnerable share, the bridge, while also setting one clear, kind limit, the boundary. Maybe you tell a friend about something you're actually struggling with instead of just sharing spiritual insights, and you also let them know you're not available for certain types of conversations that drain you. This isn't about finding your spiritual tribe or converting anyone to your way of thinking. It's about discovering that authentic connection is possible with people who might never read Jung or know what chakras are, but who can show up for real relationship. The goal shifts from finding people who are conscious to being conscious yourself in every interaction. So here's the real question. Which one of these 7 things is quitting you right now? Because here's what I've learned. You don't actually choose to quit these patterns. They start quitting you the moment your soul outgrows them. Your body starts rejecting approval seeking like it's poison. Your spirit gets allergic to performing happiness, and your authentic self literally can't pretend to need external validation anymore. This isn't something you have to force or figure out. It's something that happens naturally when you stop fighting the process and start trusting that everything falling away is making room for something infinitely better. But knowing this intellectually and actually living it are 2 completely different things, aren't they? You can understand every single concept we've talked about today, but if you're not actively practicing sitting with uncertainty, setting boundaries, or feeling your feelings without immediately trying to transcend them, nothing changes. The magic isn't in the knowing, it's in the daily choice to show up authentically even when it's uncomfortable, even when people don't understand, even when you don't know what comes next. What would happen if you picked just one of these 7 areas and committed to being brutally honest about it for the next week?
Your awakening isn't happening to you, it's happening through you, but only if you're willing to be an active participant in your own transformation. So tell me in the comments, which pattern is loosening its grip on you right now, and what are you going to do differently, starting today? And if this resonated with you, if you're ready to go deeper into what authentic spiritual growth actually looks like, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because this journey of shedding who you're not to discover who you really are, it's the most important work you'll ever do, and you don't have to do it alone.